when he was visiting them in my city of birth, Yerevan. He spent there about 2 weeks. Probably some of you know, in 1972, he was exiled. So this is the epilogue of Ovid, right? For Joseph Brodsky, the theme of exile is closely connected with the theme of empire. So he thinks a lot about empire at that time. So I am going to talk about different approaches that Brodsky takes. Of course, he wants to say something new, and he does not want to repeat what Pushkin and Mandelstam said before him, so he adds, obviously, his own spin, because his empire is, of course, fully Soviet, and it's fully developed. The revolution is done with, obviously, and Brodsky is of the generation. He was born in 1940, so the Red Terror in full swing, that sort of thing. Brodsky's Roman Empire starts from the outskirts, and the first poem on the theme is this one. It's written in 1963. Brodsky is 23 years old. It's called Ex Oriente, from the East, and it describes this death of a nameless hero, perhaps a legionary, in the sands of some eastern province. In the first stanza, in Brodsky's favorite form of paradigmatic comparison, the Roman historian Titus Livy appears. And the theme of exile, so he writes here, да точно так же, как Тит Ливий, он сидел в своем шатре, но был незримо широкими песками окружен и мял в руках письмо из Рима. So the letter from Rome, right? So that immediately alludes to Ovid, who was actually obsessed with receiving letters from Rome because that was his only lifeline. He wanted to know what's going on in Rome. So this man who is holding, or actually, jamming a letter from Rome in his hand is compared to Titus Livy, whom, it seems to me, Brodsky probably confused with Titus Flavius Vespasianus during his father's military campaign to Judea in 67 or 70 AD, and nobody except me would have noticed that mistake, because I am a classicist by education, so Titus Livy would have looked fine to anybody, but that's impossible. Livy was never sitting anywhere in any tent in any desert. It was Vespasian who was sitting. But this leads directly to Ovid, the most famous writer of letters to Rome, with whom Brodsky was many a time compared during his own exile in the north. As you know, he was exiled to the Norinskaya, who was the the north, really cold region in Russia. So Ovid occupies an important place in Brodsky's poetic imagination throughout the whole evolution of his poetry. Brodsky was a pariah of the Soviet state, following in the steps of Pushkin and Mandelstam. He finds in Ovid his ancient double not only in biographical terms, but also in terms of poetics. In 1964 to 1965, during the time of his exile in the north of Russia, Brodsky writes 2 poems connected with the Ovidian theme. One poem is called A Fragment, Отрывок. I'm sorry, I just wanted to put the whole poem here, but I'm going to read it aloud. And then he writes other letters called Ex Ponto, the last letter of Ovid to Rome. But this poem connects Brodsky directly with the Ovidian theme, and connects him also with his most beloved Russian predecessor, Осип Мандельштам. Наза к смерти не готов, оттого угрюм. От сарматских холодов в беспорядке ум. Ближе Рима ты звезда, ближе Рима к смерти. Преимущество туда можно посмотреть. Наза к смерти не готов, ближе через понт, опустевший от судов Рима горизонт. Ближе Рима Орион, между туч сквозит, Римом звать его, а он не возразит. Точно так свеча во тьму далеко видна, не готов, а что к нему ближе, чем она, Римом звать ее, любить, изредка взывать, потому что смерти быть, в Риме не бывать. So obviously this is the poem, the way it concludes, that you can die, but you can never return back to Rome, which is very much in tune with Ovid's feelings. But there is this intertwining of two of Mandelstam's most prominent themes, and it's unmistakable in this poem. One is Ovidian, but another is of the dying St. Petersburg, because the theme of death obviously is here. And the importance of this connection is manifested in yet another poem written probably in 1964. I could not quite, there are some poems by Brodsky that were never dated, even in the most scholarly editions, and so I even contacted his close friends, and they couldn't quite place it for me. So this is the poem, right, about that's written in 1964. Ведь край земли еще не край на жизни. Сам материк поддерживает то, что не в силах сделать северная почта. И эта связь доподлинно тверда, покуда еще можно на конверте поставить Ленинград за место смерти. This is again this connection of death and St. Petersburg is very Mandelstamian, but also kind of very much in tune with how Ovid felt about Rome. Like if you can still write letters there, then you still are alive. So what becomes apparent from these intertextual links is that for Mandelstam, so also for Brodsky, the theme of Rome is inextricably connected with the theme of his own city as an unattainable beloved, and to his fate in it and away from it. So ex ponto, this poem continues the Ovidian theme in Russian poetry that was very much started, as we have seen, by Pushkin and Mandelstam. However, while both Pushkin and Mandelstam added Ovid's sadness and nostalgia, Brodsky stays remarkably close to the plight of the original ex ponto. Тебе, чьи миловидные черты, должно быть, не страшатся увядания, в мой Рим, не изменившийся, как ты, со времени последнего свидания, пишу я с моря. Корабли сюда стремятся после непогоды, чтобы подтвердить, что это край земли, и в трюмах их не отыскать свободы. This, of course, in the short poem, Brodsky establishes concisely what he has in common with the ancient poet, his abandoned beloved, whose features haunt him. He was, in fact, separated from the woman he loved, Maria Basmanova. The city as a metaphor for that beloved, proximity of the sea, and his feelings about being on the edge of the earth, край земли, right? That's how Ovid calls Bessarabia or Romania. What is especially striking in the poem is the last line, which stands independently and in juxtaposition to the whole poem, revealing Brodsky's conviction about the futility of any kind of journey in pursuit of happiness or freedom, и в трюмах их не отыскать свободы, a thought that permeates several of Brodsky's early poems. There is this despair going on there. So the theme of exile reappears several times in the poetry of this period, most notably in 4 poems, Anno Domini, written in 1968, Brodsky's 28, Friends, Striving for the Latent Forms of Flattering, 1970, Second Christmas on the Shores of Never-Freezing Pontus, 1971, and then, of course, this very famous poem, Letters to a Roman Friend, Письма к римскому другу, with the subtitle from Marshall, very confusing. Marshall is very different from Ovid. He's an invective poet. He writes funny poems, but yet this poem is funny. It's also extremely nostalgic, but it's definitely an invective of the Soviet state. So in this poem, the Letters to the Roman Friend, it was written right on the eve of Brodsky's permanent departure to the West, and the theme of exile and empire becomes especially pronounced. So those two become connected here. Пусть и вправду постум курица не птица, но с куриными мозгами хватит горя, если выпало в империи родиться. Лучше жить в глухой провинции, у моря, и от Цезаря далеко, и от вьюги, лебезить не нужно, трусить, торопиться. Говори, что все наместники ворюги, но ворюга мне милей, чем кровопийца. So he's away from Rome, he's writing these lines, thinking, okay, probably in order to survive, it's better to live away from the capital city, on the margins, completely disenfranchised and alienated, but that way you actually have some tranquility and maybe inspiration for writing poetry, and definitely won't be killed because you're invisible. you don't matter anymore. All right. So there are several intertextual Roman levels in the poem. The poem belongs to the genre of letters to Rome, which immediately contextualizes it as an Ovidian allusion. The subtitle, however, from Marshall introduces the context of invective poetry, irony, satire on empire. So the addressee of the poem is called Posthumus, and he is the famous addressee actually of another Roman poet, Horace, who always contemplates kind of the irrevocability of time, existential crisis, there are, as you can see, there are numerous Roman reali in the poem. Caesar, legionary, war in Libya is going on, but there is no historical Rome, only a contemplation of what it means to be a poet living in empire. So that's why he brings so many poetic allusions from Rome into this poem. And in this poem, the joy of exile that we saw as characteristic of Pushkin and Mandelstam's Ovidian theme reappears. So the distance from Rome is seen again as a liberating experience, an opportunity for creative contemplation and heroic endeavor. In that respect, Brodsky's approach to the fate of exile differs drastically from Ovid. Although for Ovid, Rome represents the golden age of civilization, the exile from which equals cultural death and the return to which is the ultimate goal, for Brodsky, exile is yet another self-ironizing moment. It is replete with the conviction that return is not an option. And as you know, Brodsky never returned back to Russia. In that respect, the comparison of Ovid's Tristia, his most miserable poem, and Brodsky's poem, May 24, 1980, written, essentially it is the anniversary of his actual arrival to the West, but it crystallizes the way Brodsky views his fate differently from the Roman exile. Я входил вместо дикого зверя в клетку, выжигал свой срок и кликуху гвоздем в бараке, жил у моря, играл в рулетку, обедал черт знает с кем во фраке. С высоты ледника я озирал полмира, трижды тонул, дважды бывал распорот, бросил страну, что меня вскормила, из забывших меня можно составить город. Я слонялся в степях, помнящих вопли гуна, надевал на себя, что сызнова входит в моду, сеял рожь, покрывал черный только гумно и не пил только сухую воду. Я впустил свои сны, вороненный зрачок конвоя, жрал хлеб изгнания, не оставляя корок, позволял своим связкам все звуки, помимо воя, перешел на шепот, теперь мне 40. Что сказать о жизни, что оказалась длинной, только с горем я чувствую солидарность, но пока мне рот не забили глиной, из него раздаваться будет лишь благодарность. Brodsky's, the English translation, which I also want to read, is his own. He translated it himself. And so as you can see, he added here, as you will see when I read it, lines that are not in Russian. And I cannot figure out why. And I asked many commentators of Brodsky. I have brayed for wonder wild beasts steel cages, carved my term and nickname on bunks and rafters, lived by the sea, flushed aces in an oasis, dined with the devil knows whom in tales on truffles. From the height of a glacier I beheld half the world, the earthly width, twice have drowned, thrice let knives rake my nitty-gritty. Quit the country that bore and nursed me, those who forgot me would make a city. I have waded the steppes that saw yelling Huns in saddles, worn the clothes nowadays back in fashion in every quarter, planted rye, tarred the roofs of pigsties and stables, guzzled everything save dry water. I have admitted the century's third eye into my wet and foul dreams, munched the bread of exile, its stale and warty, granted my lungs all sounds except the howl, switched to a whisper, now I'm 40. What should I say about life? That it is long and abhors transparency. Broken eggs make me grieve, the omelette though makes me vomit, yet until brown clay has been crammed down my larynx, only gratitude will be gushing from it. So maybe, Marguerite, you can tell me later why is he translating this way, since you are the translation specialist. What are the eggs doing here, right? I have no idea what the eggs are doing here, and why all of a sudden his dreams became wet. It's not in Russian. So what is he doing is not clear to me. What is appearing? But you know, if you have thoughts, let me know.
Oh, I already have a bunch.
Oh, great! We can write something about it. So excellent. All right. So this poem was written on the day Brodsky turned 40. 8 years after his exile to the West. The poem extremely powerful in Russian, in my opinion, in English, even though the translation is Brodsky's own. The theme of exile addressed in this poem brings back the Ovidian allusion, even if unintentional one, specifically to his exilic poetry. There is little doubt, as the letter to Horace testifies, it's Brodsky's essay called Letter to Horace, that Brodsky admired Ovid perhaps even more than any other Roman poet, so he surely read him very carefully. But while Ovid's Tristia is full of lament and bitterness about poet's fate, Brodsky construes his poem in stark juxtaposition to Ovid's take on his banishment. So I just wanted to show you one indicative passage of Ovid's Tristia, where I'm not going to read it all because you will be, even more put to sleep and just very bored. But in this poem, it's very illustrative of its whole take on his exile. He constantly complains, God destroy me and nobody is my misfortunes. He compares himself here with Odysseus, but he says, I'm not a hero, I'm just a poet, so why am I suffering like Odysseus? Because he was a great Greek hero, so I can't do this, please send me back to Rome. So if you read it carefully, you will see that Ovid here juxtaposes his own exilic odyssey to that of Odysseus, so who was his predecessor in exile, of course, Odysseus, right? So Brodsky contrasts his own exile with Ovid's, and in that contrast we see again the stern Slava of Pushkin emerging, right? It's the shipwreck of exile, but somehow it's rejuvenated. So for Ovid, the separation from Rome is unbearable because no other place is suitable for living. Brodsky simply states that he quit his country and that the bread of exile is stale and wordy. Ovid hopes that the friends who have abandoned him in his flight still wish to know about him. And Brodsky, without much emotion, acknowledges those who forgot me would make a city. And Ovid wallows in self-pity, admits that his gentle composition is delicate, he cannot handle a trial like this. Brodsky, in the best Russian tradition, is full of gratitude for having been granted, if you look at the last line, a long life. 40 for a Russian poet is a long life, right? He can't believe he actually turned 40, considering that he had his first heart attack in his 30s. So the only reason he lived so long because he was in the United States. So Ovid's only hope for happiness depends on Augustus's mercy, permission to return. Brodsky does not even mention the possibility of homecoming and asks for no forgiveness. Most importantly, Ovid renders his exile as poetic death and asks other poets to compose the story of his suffering. Brodsky does it himself without even the use of any kind of, pretense. It is almost a passionless, factual account. Я входил вместо дикого зверя в клетку, right? So, I sat in the prison, I traveled, I did this, I don't like eggs, that sort of thing. Very mundane, in a sense. In fact, Brodsky is that very Odysseus to whom Ovid juxtaposes himself. Tough, untamed, and to some degree even joyous. In this attitude, two themes, exile and contemplation of legacy, fuse. There can be no regrets and very little of nostalgia. And Brodsky is absolutely adamant about that. So I discussed with you 3 Russian poets today. They belong to completely different political and cultural eras. And yet, while banished from or alienated by their homeland, they looked for inspiration to Ovid, the archetypal melancholy mourner of his own exile. And they essentially reconfigured his sorrowful nostalgia as unsuitable for Russian poetics. Exile became a new beginning, a liberation of sorts, a source of creative inspiration enabling these poets to soar above the mundane vicissitudes of an individual life. Thank you very much. I think I'll be happy to take any questions if we have time.
We have plenty of time
All
now
right.
that I have hijacked this room from Hunter College, apparently.
That's all right.
First of all, I wanted to say thank you so much. I apologize for the somewhat cataclysmic beginning to the evening, but it was really phenomenal and
I
interesting.
do this talk all over the place, so I'm used to cataclysmic beginnings. That's quite all right.
What would it be? Armenians without cataclysms now.
Yeah,
would we?
exactly. So on the exile, right? That's a
Speaking
cataclysm
of
right
exile.
there. Right.
Does anybody else have questions? I have a couple, though mine I suspect are really naive and silly.
No, there's no such thing, really.
Oh,
as you know.
I say that to my students all the time, but I
Exactly.
very
Exactly.
rarely mean it. No offense. So there is this trope in Russian culture about Moscow as the third Rome.
Right.
And I wonder, obviously none of the poets you discuss are actually from Moscow, but then Moscow is rarely just Moscow, it's a stand-in for Russia in general. So I wonder whether there is a larger framework of Russian poets going back to Roman poets within this cultural paradigm of feeling like, feeling like they're the cultural heirs of this paradigm.
Yeah, there is I wrote 2 books, and
On this
each
subject.
book has a chapter on Third Rome. I mean, the whole history and everything.
Mhm.
So, but I'm gonna send you.
Okay.
Yeah. So the Third Rome is a different theme because it's very much concerned with Russian Orthodoxy. So it
Mhm.
starts obviously in 16th century with the
Right,
monk
right.
Filafey writing the letter to Tsar Vasily saying, you know, Moscow is the third Rome and the fourth will never be. And it is interesting that in most of the poetry in the 20th century, it's St. Petersburg that is a third Rome, not Moscow, which is weird. And then by extension, it's Russia that is a third Rome. It's kind of big, very big Rome, right? So yes, the third Rome looms really large because Russians, as you know, were obsessed with Rome significantly less than they were obsessed with Constantinople, just historically speaking, right? So, but that is totally religious dimension. So obviously, Vladimir Solovyov writes a lot about that. Then Vyacheslav Ivanov, I worked in his archive in Rome 2 years ago, walked around it, and his archive actually is totally digitized. So I worked on it while writing my book. So he contemplates in a lot of his essays that. But poetically speaking, I think Third Rome is not that interesting to Russian poets as it is interesting to Russian religious philosophers. Rome is significantly more interesting because to them it connects Russia with civilization. Like, what is our claim to legitimacy? How do you legitimize a nascent, new culture? Well, you have to connect it with the Greco-Roman tradition. How do you do that? You do it through Crimea. So hence all of this crazy overlaps that maybe do not make sense geographically. But Rome enters, it's not, believe me, it's not just these 3 poets. In exile poetry, for example, Georgy Ivanov, who lived in Nice actually, but he constantly talks about Rome. Vyacheslav Ivanov constantly in his poetry talks, whatever you think of his poetry, talks about that. Innokenty Anitsky talks about that in his, so even like what we call a lesser poet, so those obviously are mammoths, right? So Pushkin, Mandelstam, and Brodsky cannot go bigger than that. But there is a lot of Rome, just Rome, present in their poetry, because I think to some degree having Ovid as the central archetypal point of reference, it's a point of legitimizing your own plight, right? But Third Rome looms large. Absolutely, I agree with you. It's just totally different. There will be another lecture when we will go to the correct room.
Right, correct.
So.
Robin, and Vyacheslav Ivanov converted to Catholicism.
He did
right?
in 1926. When he left Baku, he actually came to Rome from Baku, where he was the head of the classics department. He was a student of Theodor Mommsen in Germany, and Otto Hirschfeld, with whom he actually wrote outstanding dissertation on Roman taxation. And then all of a sudden he just stopped doing all things Roman and he became very concerned with Christianity. He